Greetings, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I guess we're all getting used to this new Zoom reality. Um, so what I'm going to do in this talk is share some of the research that's emerging and some research that I've been conducting with my colleague Nikos Salingaros about the ancient concept of symmetry. And as we're arguing and as we're finding, it's a newly relevant concept in many fields, in physics and in mathematics and in biology, and we think in architecture. We think it's overdue to be investigated more carefully in the field of architecture. Some of this work, by the way, was generously funded by the Axon Johnson Foundation, so I owe a great debt of gratitude to them. So I want to unpack some of this research, and we'll run through it and explain what we find so remarkable about this research. So this is a paper that Nikos and I wrote for the journal Symmetry, Culture, and Science. And we report on some of these findings, especially the mathematical aspects of them. Nikos is a mathematician. And as we know, symmetry is certainly a core topic in the history of architecture up to the 20th century. But what we see is that it has become marginalized in favor of a more functionalist conception. Yet things going on in many other fields have given new dynamism to this ancient topic. And that carries implications for the practice of architecture and other environmental design professions that, as we argue, have not been well understood where they've been considered at all. And therefore, this paper argues that a reassessment is long overdue. One thing that I want to note at the outset is that symmetry is not just the left and right mirror images or reflectional symmetry. There's also rotational symmetry. There's translational symmetry. There is scaling symmetry or fractals. You're familiar with that term. There's also compound symmetries that bring together those different forms, like the beautiful patterns of a kaleidoscope or the fractal patterns of a beautiful rug, or many of the patterns in nature have these compound symmetries as well. And there are the tiling symmetries that have created very beautiful structures in many cultures in history. And then there's something that we refer to as deep symmetries. In other words, symmetries between ourselves as the viewer and the scene that we're viewing, whether it's another human being and the symmetries with our own body, our own physical self, a beautiful sunset or beautiful buildings in the landscape and so on. And those are very powerful experiences as well. So let's remember that the word symmetry comes from the Greek syn, together, and metron, measure. In other words, the correspondence between different forms with similar measurements or shapes. And this symmetrical form is going to be invariant through some kind of a transformation. So reflection, a rotation, a translation, scale changes or other changes. And compared to the original form, we can see what we call a symmetry. And this is also a very important concept in other forms of mathematics. At the end of the day, an equation is nothing other than an expression of a symmetry between the two sides of a formula, right? In physics, symmetry is also a very hot topic, looking at the ways that different particles have symmetries with one another, other structures of the universe, transforming and differentiating, but preserving some symmetric relationships, even though they might go through symmetry breaking and partially become no longer symmetrical. And this seems to be a very important aspect of the transformations that occur in many structures of the universe. In fact, some have proposed that the Big Bang is a kind of symmetry breaking event that created the subsequent differentiations that gave rise to all the other structures of the cosmos. And there's also symmetry in information theory, because information is really nothing other than a symmetrical relationship between two structures in the world that are of interest to us. One of them gives us information about the other. It is informed, literally, it has a symmetrical form relating to the other. For example, a sound wave can have a digital representation, and the measurement preserves that symmetrical relationship and can regenerate that same wave again. And there are physicists who have proposed that information understood as symmetry is the fundamental structure of the universe, a really fascinating idea, I think. And in linguistics and in epistemology too, the idea that A linguistic construct is both a representation of a symmetry with another structure that is of interest to us, and it can generate a symmetrical structure. It creates an architecture of possibility, if you will. And that's a really real thing in the world. If I say, well, I'm going to meet you at the bus stop tomorrow at 2:30 or tomorrow at 3:30, suddenly I've generated a possibility or a range of possibilities about how that's going to take place tomorrow. And so this view of things really helps us to understand many of the confusions that often bedevil our understanding of linguistic constructions and social constructions and the construction of meaning and so on, and ultimately the nature of reality, I think. And there are some really fascinating examples of symmetry in biology. In fact, this fascinating paper talking about how the Cambrian explosion might have followed a kind of pattern language structure, a structure of patterns that generated that multicellular form. Very interesting paper. And then this paper also by one of those two authors talking about how deviation from the pattern and organized form that ensures life ultimately can lead to death, can lead to cancer. And in architecture, in the built environment, the deviation, he says, allows the takeover of mechanical and image-based building ideologies, leading to dysfunctional and lifeless buildings and public spaces. Quite an interesting idea, I think. And he refers to the architect Christopher Alexander's work, who talks about wholeness extending transformations in, for example, symmetry breaking events like this famous picture by Edgerton of a milk drop hitting a plane of milk. And what you see is that the original symmetry of the milk drop is shattered, but it doesn't become a disordered mess. It gives rise to many new symmetries and many new forms of order. And Alexander describes those in great detail, talking about levels of scale and strong centers and boundaries and so on. And that this is actually what goes on all the time in our environment, in our work, when we're building our environments. And those properties exist in many of the most successful and beautiful buildings that we know. So Alexander has actually categorized these 15 properties. I'll just show them briefly here. I won't go into detail about them, but it's a fascinating subject that he talks about in his book, The Nature of Order. And he argues that indeed, the buildings and structures that we experience on a daily basis, the most beautiful ones, have these very properties that have been generated through these kinds of symmetry breaking processes, through craftsmanship and through differentiation and through placemaking. Now, symmetry, as I said, has an honorable place in architectural history. It goes back to Pythagoras, certainly, and to Vitruvius and others. And Vitruvius had a very sophisticated definition of symmetry, a proper agreement between the members of the work itself, and relation between the different parts and the whole, the ancient subject of Mariology, as it's called. And this is a very interesting and I think sophisticated idea in light of new science. And also Alberti during the Renaissance was very sophisticated about different kinds of symmetry. Of course, reflectional symmetry was beginning to dominate then, as it dominated ever since in many ways in architecture. But Alberti had a much more nuanced view. And in fact, what he talked about was so as to correspond to one another as a species, a very sophisticated idea, I think. And symmetry was also an interrelationship of parts and wholes, or what he called consinitas, a kind of harmony. And Alberti continued to echo Vitruvius's and Pythagoras's broader conception of symmetry, and indeed foreshadowed some of the more recent work as well. In fact, Alberti has a quite modern view, talking about a kind of mutual interplay of the parts of a thing that has to do with the mathematical properties. And there's something else that has to do with the harmony, the consinitas, that is critical to symmetry, critical to beauty, actually. And yet we are left today with the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that it's entirely socially constructed. And there's evidence that that's simply not true, as I'll come back to. But let's look, for example, at the usage of the term symmetry in books since 1800. This is Google's Ngram viewer that shows the frequency of terms. And you'll see that symmetry has been quite significant since 1800, still up there. It's come down a little bit since about 1980 or so. but still a significant topic. But now here it is in architecture. You can see a very steep drop off down to historic lows. It's about 1950s, 1960s. And at the same time, you see the growth of the term architectural functionalism really coming on by storm in the 1920s and beyond. And today it is much higher. But what is this functionalism? Is it truly functionalism, or is it more of an image of functionalism? Because if you look at, for example, Le Corbusier's work, his idea of functionalism is that we would use grain silos and cruise ships as the components of images for human beings to live in buildings. But that's not function. Human beings are not grains of rice, and buildings don't have to go whooshing down the street and resist, the crashing of the waves or something. So this is an image-based approach to functionalism, a kind of packaging, if you will, that is not an authentic form of function. Well, let's be clear. Function is not the problem, as long as we understand that there is also a function of promoting human health and well-being. There's a function played by beauty and by symmetry, and that is indeed what the research is showing. There is emerging some research about the relationship between symmetry and health. So Nikos and I have concluded that there may actually be a shortage of symmetry in the human environment today that is causing significant impacts on health and well-being. The term symmetry deficit disorder is a reference to journalist Richard Liu's term, nature deficit disorder, the need to be in nature and natural environments. And for similar reasons, which I'll talk about, we see a kind of symmetry deficit disorder that is deeply problematic in the human environment as well. But this is the link, again, between symmetry and beauty, or if you will, symmetry as beauty. And for the next part of the talk, I want to explore that idea a little further. Because, of course, many people say, isn't beauty only in the eye of the beholder? And new research evidence says, no, that is not the case. In fact, we can now measure with MRI equipment and other new technologies exactly what's going on in the brain and where. And there are certain parts of the brain that are activated, differentially engaged, as they say here. And this goes back to Edmund Burke's comment that beauty is some quality in bodies acting mechanically upon the human mind by the intervention of the senses. And this is indeed what we're seeing, that the sense of beauty is triggered by the objective parameters of stimuli, the structure that's actually in the world. And yes, there is a socially constructed subjective aspect of it as well. So we might think of this as a kind of trunk that is branching out from a common biological root to the socially constructed and differentiated versions of beauty that might be outliers or in differentiated forms of beauty. But the important thing that we need to think about is that most people are still clustered around that biological trunk. And if we're serving most people as professionals, if we're serving the users, then we have to recognize that our social constructions, our forms of differentiation of beauty might not be appropriate for most of the people that we work for. I think there's a professional responsibility here that we need to recognize. And Samir Zeki, a professor at University College London, talks about nourishing the human emotional brain. And he concludes that, yes, this is what goes on. And this is very important, actually. Beauty is not as subjective as it may seem. And as he says, it probably lies in satisfying inherited brain concepts of proportion, harmony, and geometric relationships that can be expressed in mathematical terms. And therefore, the experience of beauty in the environment is not a luxury, but an essential ingredient in nourishing the emotional brain. So I think you can begin to see that for similar reasons, symmetry is also an essential ingredient in the human environment, without which we are suffering significant impacts on health and well-being, ecological lifestyles, and many other issues that we're facing today. So thank you for the invitation to speak and to share what I think is a very interesting and exciting frontier topic, ancient topic, as well as a very modern topic. And a lot more work needs to be done in this field. Thanks.